So we said money can exist in commodity backed, or fiat forms, but that money is also electronic in a lot of cases, and the figure is staggering. It's, if you, depending on where you check, it's anywhere from 92% up to kind of 97% of all money supply globally is currently in an electronic form. So in a bank account somewhere of some kind, is not part of physical cash, which is crazy.
Damn. It's just numbers, right? It's just numbers on a screen. You're like, what the hell? That is so crazy. It's just numbers on someone's computer somewhere.
Yeah, that's magic internet money for sure. So this, as you say, it is a scary thought. And so when we say digital money, we might as well say money, because most of it is digital, most of it is electronic already.
Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Hello, Jack, my co-host, my friend. How are you doing this fine Sunday afternoon?
Yeah, not too bad. Thanks, Alec. Having a nice weekend so far. How about yourself?
Yeah, it's been a good weekend. It's been busy. And we're topping it all off. The cherry on top is that we get to record another fascinating episode of a topic that relates to Web3.
Yeah, exactly. And today we're covering one that I think is very highly related to a few we've done before and might seem like duplication at first glance. We're talking about digital cash, and we say that all the time when we talk about Bitcoin. But actually, I think there's a lot more to dig into that maybe we haven't touched on before, including the history of that term and different systems. So yeah, why don't we kick off with some definitions first, just to lay the ground on what we think digital cash is. So yeah, go ahead, Alec. What do you think?
Straight in there. Well, I would say that cash it's a legal medium of exchange, right? It's like a kind of, I say, a constant maybe medium of exchange that's traditionally issued and maintained by the government. A tangible good is probably like when we were talking before. It's like allows e-commerce basically to have standards that we can kind of procure different goods and kind of adhere to the same standards when we're procuring things. And I guess digital cash is just the exact same, but in the digital world, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty simple one, really. I mean, it does involve, I think this topic we need to talk about the meaning of money itself. And again, neither of us really monetary theory experts, but you need a kind of basic grasp of these terms. So for me, if you think of money as all the different forms with which you can pay for services, use it as a medium of exchange, store value, etc. Cash is the physical subset of money in general. And then digital cash is simply the digital representation of physical cash. So it's essentially trying to replicate the properties and the functionality of normal cash, physical cash, in a digital realm, essentially.
Yeah, which is, it's kind of weird. Sounds a bit like a bit of a contrast or a bit of a controversy to say, okay, well, cash is the physical subset of money, which is every kind of legal medium of consistent exchange. And then digital cash is no longer the physical version of that. So you're like, okay, why is that not money then? And hopefully we kind of get into the depths of the difference between money and cash, and what digital cash kind of hopes to replicate cash, but in the digital world, what the advantages and benefits of that are. But you were right earlier on in saying that we have touched on some of this stuff before, especially in the token episodes, because I mean, I guess cash is probably one of the most well-known tokens that people kind of have kind of a tangible understanding of. So there will be a tiny bit of duplication, but I think it's really important to get to grips with the history and the evolution of cash and money to really understand, like, because I mean, history comes around in waves, right, in circles, and it were kind of the things that we're experiencing now, the reasonings and justifications for digital cash are actually things that we've experienced before, and there's actually kind of a precedent's been set in the past, and I think we're seeing that come about again. So I think going into the history will be interesting for us, definitely, but also kind of set the tone for why we need digital cash in the current age.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't we kick it off by going, all the way back to the start, as we do when we talk about money. And I know we have before about, okay, the very earliest form of exchange really was what we call the barter system. So this is how, hundreds and thousands of years ago, you would have been trading goods and services directly for other goods and services. So there wasn't a medium of exchange to mediate that exchange. You would just directly, give your barrel of grain for a basket of apples or something, right? And they refer to this, I think, as they call it the double coincidence of wants problem that you come up to here, because you need two people. You need someone who wants the apples at the same time as someone who wants the barrel of grain or something.
Yeah, so I'm going to call BS on this. Since we first did our tokens episode and we talked about this barter system, I've done some reading, and actually the barter system, where we kind of think of it on like a societal or high civilization level, didn't exist. Like the problem that you just kind of defined makes it almost impossible to imagine like a barter society. Remember we were talking about it in episode 3, tokens, and we're like, hey, how the hell can I as a chicken farmer convert my chickens into cows? Like, it just doesn't work. And actually the kind of the current understanding is that barter systems didn't really exist. The kind of the stages of evolution of exchange were very much, we had these tribes of 150 max that we kind of talked about before, and they were kind of quite socialist in a way. There was no like exchanging to an extent, especially of like commodities and like food and goods. Everyone contributed to a single tribe. And obviously, when we expanded those tribes out to civilizations and all this kind of stuff, it was no longer possible to contribute in that way. And they said, well, as soon as that started to happen, then we started to have the next stage, which was commodity money, like standards of mediums of exchange that actually facilitated the exchange. So sorry to call you out nice and early, but I thought that was quite an interesting twist on what we said last time we talked about this.
Well, keep me on my toes, Alec. I mean, this is the thing. I think. Yeah, I would definitely say I think the barter system is one of these things you learn about in school, right? As like the early days of exchange. And yeah, I'm kind of I'm not familiar with the details of medieval history and things like that. But what I can imagine from your saying is like, yeah, what we call a barter system is actually a thing whereby people are exchanging, but because of this, this problem of you need the coincidence of wants, then actually that's not in practice, that's never happening. So you're just having people sharing things with each other in the expectation that things will be shared with them when they need it. So it's kind of the barter system is kind of a nice euphemism for actually what was a fairly socialist situation.
Yeah, I think maybe that's the issue. Maybe it's that the people hate the term socialist. They're like, instead of calling it socialism, everyone contributing to an overall gain without the need for profit, they're like, we'll just call it barter system. That sounds slightly more capitalist and all this kind of stuff. So maybe that was the reason. But yeah, barter system didn't exist on any kind of large scale at all. It was more small tribes, in a socialist system contributing to the tribe overall, because like we said, very difficult for someone who specializes in chicken farming to assume they're going to get milk and cheese and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, that was the first stage. Socialism was the first stage, and then we moved away from that as these tribes expanded into kind of started to globalize, started to expand into more society level society level populations. And then we moved to commodity money. So this is the first type of money that we're going to speak about, commodity money. So this is very much like goods used as a medium of exchange. We can think of like useful goods, like the best examples probably be grain, cattle, spices, things that actually have intrinsic value being used as mediums of exchange.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the one kind of, I think as you're saying, the motivation for this was effectively what we would refer to as scale, right? Especially in Web3. It was the fact that this previous society, barter or otherwise, did not scale very well to large populations. So you needed to have some kind of commodity or some kind of fixed medium of exchange that you could use to actually, resolve that issue that you never have a coincidence of wants. You need a commodity that you can exchange at the point where you want something, and then the person buying that from you can then use to buy something else later, etc. So yeah, it's interesting. And you had all different types of mediums you'd use, right? Like the grain and cattle, spices and things like that. Metals as well came a little bit later than that. But yeah, it's a super interesting period, I think, when that started. And it just shows the need for, when you have large popular societies, you have to have a uniform medium exchange to function, really.
Yeah, and you've already got like one of the first words in that's going to come later. Scale was important. Another one was trust. Not trust necessarily in the underlying technology because it's just grain, but trust that people would want this. everyone at this time needs grain. Everyone maybe didn't necessarily need cattle all the time, but they understood there was always going to be an intrinsic desire or want to have cattle. So they trusted in the exchange of these. An interesting one for me was that the ancient Romans actually used salt as a medium exchange, because they always assumed that people would want salt. And it's actually where the term salary comes from. Salt, salary. Yeah, interesting factoid to get in nice and early.
Didn't know you're multilingual, Alec. That's a new one.
Yeah, then the next one that you were talking about was metal coins, and the link there is kind of obvious. We said that, like, it's commodities, things that have in kind of intrinsic value that were useful to society, and in the same way, coins were just kind of an easier, not easier, I guess, easier to transact form of this, right? Because metals, golds, silvers, even coppers early on, kind of in the earlier versions, they had intrinsic value. They could be used for jewelry, weapons, all this kind of stuff. And I guess some people might be saying, okay, well, if I'm a farmer, does gold necessarily have intrinsic value to me? I'm not going to be eating gold as like as an absolute necessity. But I think it comes back to the trust. That there's a kind of a need or a desire for gold in society. And that's the reason that they could invest in these, and they still have like tangible value. And I've seen there's actually been a lot of people that say, okay, well, gold doesn't actually have a tangible value. Like, it's only been in like the last 200 years or something like that we started to use in specific like manufacturing processing engines and things like this. And it's actually quite a good point, is that gold maybe doesn't have a super tangible value. It's kind of this societal perception of value that we've placed on gold. And then I've seen some people compare and contrast this with like Bitcoin and say, well, Bitcoin doesn't have a tangible value like gold. And you kind of, well, gold, we kind of put this pressure and this kind of emphasis on gold in society for 4,000 years. So we know there's always going to, well, maybe not always, but there is going to be a societal want for gold. And that doesn't really exist in Bitcoin yet, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other analogy with gold-backed money and using gold as a commodity for monetary systems is this idea of scarcity. And you'll see people talking about that all the time in relation to Bitcoin, because it's difficult to mine more gold. It has a relatively fixed or low inflating supply, which is why, I mean, when people talk about money, they talk about it having a few distinct characteristics. So one of them being a medium of exchange, one of them being a good store of value, and one of them being a good unit of account. And to achieve these three things, scarcity is quite important to that, because if you had a very highly inflating or highly fluctuating supply of that metal, and I think this is also why you're saying there's a demand for gold in society, but it's also not something that why it was kind of a sweet spot. I think my understanding is that because it's not used industrially quite as much as other commodities, that keeps the supply more fixed, or there's not a demand in other places, that it becomes sensible as a choice of commodity to be used as money, because that becomes the main thing. And obviously there's demand from other sources like your royalties and things, but that combination of it being scarce and it having some kind of utility in society, but not one where you're building everything from it. In the Iron Age, you're not using gold for obvious reasons to build everything, so it would have been more difficult to use those different kind of metals as commodities. And as you say, you see this in this analogy with Bitcoin, because you have an associated cost and difficulty with mining Bitcoin as well. And also the fact that it has a fixed supply. So in that sense, you could say Bitcoin does mirror gold in a way, because it has a relatively fixed supply. Or Bitcoin has a fixed supply and gold has a relatively fixed or low inflating supply. And there's a kind of physical or energetic cost to getting more of it, to mining more of it right now. The analogy breaks down a little bit once Bitcoin is issued, but we'll deal with that later.
Yeah, so like I think people can kind of quite easily imagine the idea of metal coins acting like servicing exchange as a medium exchange kind of makes sense. There's a very easy relation to paper notes today that represent something. There's a central authority which issues the standardized coins, and then within society, there's a kind of knowledge of what that coin represents and what that coin has the purchasing power, is probably the term, for that coin. So people can get behind that. And that was kind of the standard for, 2000 years, when it was invented really in 600 BC by the Lydians, and all the way through to probably the 17th century. But, there was actually some challenges to the use of it. One, it's pretty heavy. You want to exchange a lot of metal coins to buy a house or something like that. That's quite inconvenient. You don't want to be lugging around these heavy metal coins all the time. Another one was, which is sounds like quite a weird one, was the wearing problem. Like the idea of like exchanging coins constantly, you actually get this kind of this wearing down of the coin, and over time you actually lose value and weight of the coin, which seems a bit mad to me now. But back in the day, it was actually one of the main reasons that they actually moved to the next system that we're going to talk about. And the final problem they had was this thing called the replacement problem, where it's like, if I have, 500 gold coins and I lose 500 gold coins because I'm taking it everywhere and it's heavy and everyone knows I've got 500 gold coins, they're gone forever. Same problem with cash, right? They're gone forever. So the next era that kind of surpassed metal coins was commodity-backed paper money. So it was literally representing the physical gold, for example, that's in a vault somewhere by a bank, with paper notes that represents ownership, and you can exchange these much more easily and much more convenient paper notes that represents ownership of gold that's, say, held by a bank somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of this solved a lot of problems. You have the Bretton Woods system that pegs the US dollar, and that becomes a kind of global standard to the price of gold. And one of the big challenges this also solves is divisibility, because you need, if you have a bar of gold, it's not very easy to pay for something that costs much less than a bar of gold. And this kind of links on to the idea of micropayments we've talked about a lot, being able to do smaller and smaller payments. If you're lugging around bars of gold, whether you're wearing them or not, it's very hard to divide that for smaller payments for kind of day-to-day transactions. And that's also linked to the scarcity. There's a bit of a mismatch between the value of what you want to exchange, for day-to-day purchases, and how it's stored up in physical gold stores. So yeah, when you come to commodity-backed paper money, in particular the gold standard and gold-backed commodity money, then you have this ability to issue notes, physical cash against that commodity, basically stored in reserve, and pegged to the price of the currency you're issuing, say US dollar, and then it becomes much easier. And also there's, this will be related when we come back to evolving to digital cash, but there are a lot of costs associated even with modern physical cash, but even more so with securing commodity money. That's part of why you want to move to commodity-backed paper money, because all of a sudden the security problem is much less if you're having to just secure a few physical notes as opposed to the gold bar that you might use and can't divide. So there's a few things there.
True. Like there are also some issues that kind of come into play around fraud, though, right? Like it's very hard for me to fraud a solid gold bar if I'm exchanging with you. It's very easy for you to test on the spot. But a paper note, especially when this kind of came into practice in, say, the 17th century, like it's very easy to fraud a paper note, just saying this is from the bank, Alec has one gold bar, here it is, that kind of thing. So fraud was a big challenge that actually came about from commodity-backed paper money. Another big one was the idea of printing money and inflation, right? So at the start of this, especially in the West, it was around like the 17th century where they started to have like commodity-backed paper money. It was very much like the paper money represented gold that you had in reserve. So you couldn't overinflate. You couldn't all of a sudden say, I have more paper-backed money because I don't all of a sudden have lots more gold. But it was around, I think it was after World War One, and after like the economic crises, a lot of people had lost gold to war, and there's been overspending and stuff like that. But they still needed money in the economy to pay, soldiers, to pay for buildings, to pay for projects. So all of a sudden, you saw that countries were starting to write paper notes, commodity-backed paper money, allegedly, that represented gold in reserve that they didn't actually have. And this is where we started to see the advent, in a way, of the next stage, which is fiat. And fiat, it blows my mind. Like still to this day, fiat blows my mind. So we have commodities as money, understood. There's tangible benefit there. Then we have commodity-backed paper money. Again, it's underpinned. It's just an easy way to represent something that still has tangible use and tangible benefits. It's practical and all this kind of stuff. And then we come to the next era of money, which is fiat, which is this idea of paper notes that are now not backed by anything. And one of the main reasons that this happened was after World War II. Like I said, a lot of countries were in debt and they no longer had the gold reserves to actually, you know, be able to invest in the economies. There was like a whole problem with obviously the Great Depression and all this kind of stuff, where countries needed to invest in the economy, but they didn't have the gold in reserve to actually issue money to pay for development and all this kind of stuff. So all of a sudden, the great minds of the world got together and said, well, why don't we just start to make up our own currency that doesn't have to be backed to anything? And you already started to see the overlap potential with Bitcoin. And they started to use what was fiat. And yeah, that's the whole system that we're working in now, this kind of made up paper money. And, you know, hate it or love it, that's the system we're in right now.
Yeah, people call Web3 magic internet money, but really fiat money is like magic paper money or magic government money.
Monopoly money.
Monopoly money. But yeah, I think it's interesting as you kind of articulated really nicely. There's this change in the trust model really as you go from commodity money, pure commodity money, to commodity-backed paper money, and then to fiat, which is essentially government-backed paper money. Because, you know, going from commodity to commodity-backed, as you said, you have the counterfeit problem becomes more prevalent because it's easy to verify that gold is gold. It's not so easy to verify that this banknote is actually associated with some gold. So you're trusting the issuer of those notes. You're trusting that they haven't been duplicated by the issuer, et cetera, et cetera. And then you move from commodity-backed paper money to government-backed paper money, or fiat, where you don't even have an asset in reserve necessarily to verify against. It's more based on, to be honest, as I understand it, it's more based on confidence in the economy of that country, right? Which is much harder to define, much harder to verify. There's lots of different factors you have to take in to control that. It's almost impossible to validate, you know, how or why a currency should be at a certain price. It just becomes this big free market problem. But yeah, so we've kind of the modern state of money prior to kind of Bitcoin and Web3 based digital money is much more government trusted. That's the commodity if there is one that you're using now.
Yeah, exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. I think like we were at the stage of commodity backed paper money, and the problem was that governments and central banks at the time, which kind of existed in a way, they didn't have the flexibility to invest in the economy and to push the economy and have the tools at their disposal to get them out of the Great Depression. So they came up with fiat, this imaginary monopoly money, effectively at the time, that they had the flexibility, they had complete control over how much was in circulation. Like they could start to control, inflation, through interest rates and printing lots of money and all this kind of stuff. And it gave them the tools to then control the economy. But with that, like a lot of critiques of the fiat system said it gave them too much power and were now completely beholden to, not a few individuals, but a few entities that effectively have the responsibility of keeping currency stable with only, one or two mechanisms at the disposal, which is interest rates to get people who have money in their bank to either say, start saving because it will give you loads of money if you do save, or start spending and we won't give you much money if you do save, and printing money. And, a lot of people a lot of critiques of the fiat system would like a return to the gold standard because they kind of believe that this control, this flexibility that central banks actually have is leading to more economic crises, for example.
Yeah, and I think actually a few years ago when I had even less understanding of how money worked, this idea of money printing leading to inflation definitely was not as pressing a concern in my mind because I hadn't lived through an example of that happening and it being rife. But then obviously went through COVID and we saw effectively money printing across the globe, in particular in places like America, just to stimulate the economy. You hear the phrase stimmy checks in America. And that's also quite funny, I think, because they were all issued in check-based form, not digitally, very, very notably to people. And yeah, we're just seeing the effects of that now. And you're seeing in the UK as well, that lever, as you said, of the central banks using interest rates very clearly as the way to control inflation that we're experiencing. Yeah. So if you're trying to buy a house or get a mortgage in the UK right now, it's pretty scary. So yeah, that kind of wraps up the journey all the way from barter systems, whether or not they existed, to fiat money.
I would one thing that I think we need to talk about is we've talked about central banks, and I just want to introduce the concept of what a central bank is very briefly, just so people are on board with it. So most people's interaction daily will be with a commercial bank, like Santander, HSBC. These are privately run banks that are service providers, right? They're for profit. They give out loans, they charge interest on loans, they invest your money in places, and they make profit, right? Private entities. So your bank account with Santander, that is private money held by Santander on your behalf, okay? Then we have central banks. These are kind of public-private entities, a bit weird, right? And their whole mandate is to regulate a country's currency. So when we talked about introducing fiat, which was these kind of, I don't know, fake monopoly money style things, we have to regulate the trust in that currency so people can feel confident in exchanging it because it's no longer gold backed. So the emphasis and the importance of central banks when the fiat systems came in was, well, it became key. It was really important. It was critical to say. So they issue and regulate the currency. And they can also, kind of do that with raising and lowering interest rates and printing money and have like financial systems and all that. But their whole mandate is financial stability of the currency that they run. So like the Bank of England is the pound's kind of regulatory body to ensure stability for the pound. And most countries, or well, every kind of currency will have some central bank that does that.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you defined it so clearly, because it's good. It's important to know that there is literally an entity in most countries around the world now that have their own fiat currency in the central bank that effectively has humans making decisions about effectively about the value of a currency, which is a huge move away from the earlier forms of money, which, dependent on the scarcity of gold, for example, being dependent more on an intrinsic property of the world, right, which it can't control.
Exactly. When you look when you compare countries, so most people believe in the dollar because they're like, okay, this is a very highly regulated, trusted system that's existed. There's not much volatility in the economy, all this kind of stuff. But like you said, humans are fallible. You look at Zimbabwe and the currency they use. That's an example of human intervention of the currency, human regulation of a currency that went very wrong. So the trust in that system failed completely. Lots of people pulled money out, hyperinflation. The economy suffered massively because of that. And a lot of people there actually will use the dollar as a means of exchange because that is stable and trusted, because the humans involved in that do a much better job of regulating that currency. So I'm really glad you brought the human element there.
Exactly. So I think that also is a good way to move on to the thing we're actually meant to be talking about. Now we've built it up is digital cash or digital money as well, and we'll talk about both of those because they are slightly different. But that is one of the motivations for moving to a digital cash, because they can be implemented in a way that is more robust, that is not dependent on the whims of individuals necessarily. So just to kind of briefly set the scene, what is digital cash and how long has it been a thing? So we said money can exist in commodity backed or fiat forms, but that money is also electronic in a lot of cases, and the figure is staggering. It's depending on where you check, it's anywhere from 92% up to kind of 97% of all money supply globally is currently in an electronic form. So in a bank account somewhere of some kind is not part of physical cash, which is crazy.
Damn. It's just numbers, right? It's just numbers on a screen. You're like, what the hell? That is so crazy. It's just numbers on someone's computer somewhere.
Yeah, that's magic internet money for sure. So this, as you say, it is a scary thought. And so when we say digital money, we might as well say money, because most of it is digital, most of it is electronic already. And this is because, we've moved to accessing and transferring funds electronically in general. So, we still have physical cards, but they are interacting when we tap them, to get on the tube or pay at a coffee shop. They are accessing electronic and digital systems to transfer money that are transferring money between digital bank accounts where all the money is digitally residing. So it's massively digital already, in case anyone didn't realize this, which is something that I also wasn't aware of until a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And like you said, I think even the physical cards, they're dying out now. I have a digital card on my phone right now for the exact same reasons people prefer digital money, that they want a digital card. Convenience, right? It's all about convenience at the end of the day. And like it's really interesting. Like I think when people think of the money they own, they don't really realize that it's private. And I do want to kind of really emphasize the difference between private and public. When we talk about like physical cash that is like issued by a government, that is public money. You own the cash. And this is a very big Web3 concept, right? Ownership. It's very hard for someone to take away that £20 note that I have in my back pocket. That is real ownership right there. When we talk about money, as Jack just said, like numbers in my bank account with Santander, that is private money. Santander is effectively looking after my money on my behalf. If all of a sudden Santander wants to say, you're not allowed to touch this money anymore, they can do that. And they have done that. Like the example we gave was those lorry drivers in Canada, right? They were getting lots of sponsorship for their protests in Canada. And all of a sudden, the Canadian government were like, okay, I want you to switch off their bank accounts so they cannot access any of the funds that's been sent to them. And that's an example of private money and the kind of what can happen when things go wrong. And like a lot of people will be like, okay, well, you know, I'm a law-abiding citizen. I'm fine with that. Like if it stops terrorists and all this kind of stuff, that's fine with me. But if it starts to stop protesters, that's a big infringement on freedoms, right? Just because you agree with the current government and their ability to do that with those people, what if a government comes into power that all of a sudden you don't start to agree with their policies and you're one of those people that they consider non-desirable and they cut off your money? So that this ownership thing that we talk about in Web3 really does apply to money. And it's one of the kind of the driving principles behind digital cash, because that is, you know, ownership.
Yeah, exactly. And it's ownership is such a key concept, because when you think about something like physical cash, I think the term is a bearer instrument. So essentially, the bearer, the person holding that note, is deemed the owner of it, right? And can use it at the point of sale, right? As we expect. And a lot of the money doesn't necessarily function like that, because there's no way of proving that. There's ownership information stored in databases. You have to verify against banks and things like that. And digital cash, I think, is very much trying to replicate that bearer instrument aspect of cash, which is crucial. So if you can present the correct cryptographic information in the case of a digital cash system, that's the equivalent of having physical ownership. And there's lots of nuance about the term ownership in the crypto world, and the, you know, various legal bodies around the world are trying to get to grips with this, trying to define what does ownership actually mean in the context of digital assets and digital cash. But maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. I think I want to very quickly touch on the history of digital cash itself, because it does, even though we've just said this is kind of the end point of the whole history of cash and money, there is a little bit of history of the term itself. But yeah, go on.
Do we want to talk about some of the, before we go into digital cash, talk about some of the challenges that we see with digital money right now? I kind of just briefly touched on the ownership one, but like, you know, you're talking about 92%, did you say, of all money is digital, which is in a lot of ways private. As part of that, we kind of, there's a lot of monopoly on private money. Especially say in the US, for example, there's like 4 card providers. Was it MasterCard, Visa? I can't remember the 2, Amex and something else. Like it's very centralized. And in a way, monopolies in a lot of ways are bad. It means they can charge whatever fee they want and have non-competition, all this kind of stuff. So like I say, this is high fees, very high fees, middlemen involved in the checking between, you know, account 1, account 2, and all the steps in between. So right now it's very expensive, even though it is digital, it's all about efficiency and speed and all this kind of stuff. Digital money is very expensive. There's lots of middlemen, high fees, lots of minimum payments, for example, not being able to spend on your Amex below that 150 and all this kind of stuff because the costs are too high. So I just want to set the scene there that there is a lot of problems with digital money as we kind of think of it right now.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you mentioned that, because this high fees and middlemen is exactly what we talk about when we talk about Bitcoin and micropayments side of things. This is one of the things that you're trying to move away from in digital cash. So not just replicating cash systems, but also when you're replicating cash systems in a digital context, you don't want to introduce the same middlemen that cause the high fees in most digital money that we interact with. I think that's a really good point that you've made there. So yeah, I think with that said, let's just recap very quickly, you know, what the current state of digital cash is and how we've got here, because it's actually quite interesting. So again, for context, why are we moving to digital cash? In addition to what you've said, the use of physical cash is dying significantly. So I saw some really interesting figures for the UK in particular. So there were apparently 23 million people in the UK, which is a very significant portion of our small island. They apparently didn't use any cash payments in 2021. And thinking back, I could well have been one of those people, in 2021. I don't really recall having physical cash in my pocket much lately. And there are predictions that, it's going to go to kind of just 6% of global payments being non-cash based in 10 years, which is tiny, right?
That's crazy, especially when I'm biased and it's a bit weird when I think of the West as being slightly more digitally advanced and maybe less economically developed countries. The idea of everyone being able to make a digital payment there as well, it's just crazy. Like less than 6%. That's mad. And this is a concern, right, for central banks, is when we're talking about their priority being maintenance of fiscal policy and all this kind of stuff. Cash is a big part of that. And when things get into the private money realm, it's slightly, not just private money, but also when they talk about crypto and all this kind of stuff, kind of gets out of their control more and more. And I assume they don't like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that the privacy issue is becoming huge when you have governments now thinking about things like CBDC, which we'll come on to. But people are really worried about the privacy implications of moving to more and more digital money. I mean, ironically, given what we've just said, we should already be quite worried given how much is electronic. But it's actually the advent of these of CBDCs and things where people are starting to think, well, are we going to eliminate physical cash entirely? Is the system going to move completely into this digital version where maybe in some countries privacy is not going to be particularly well preserved in these systems? So it's a big topic right now.
So I understand the perspective of why we'd want digital cash from the user perspective, right? I care about my privacy. I don't want these private banks seeing all my transactions and all this kind of stuff. I like cash because it's peer-to-peer, which is the word we love to use, or the phrase we love to use, peer-to-peer. And that also means efficient in a way because there's no middlemen, but also I get the privacy and security and all this kind of stuff because of that. And, you could say the central bank has a responsibility to enable that because they kind of work on behalf of the citizens. But the central bank also wants digital cash because they want to have some kind of control, right, still. And we're saying that if more currency is being pushed towards the private sector, potentially cryptocurrencies, which central banks are opposed to, we'll kind of come on to it a bit later, that's kind of moving outside of their control now. It makes it harder for them to regulate fiscal policy, right? So now I understand the motivations of why people want it and why central banks want it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the motivations have never been higher than they are right now. So speaking of that, we're talking about the conditions right now in the world in 2023, but actually people have been thinking about digital cash systems for a very, very long time in kind of the 80s, as early as the 80s and 90s, really. So one of the very first and very famous examples of a digital cash system was something called eCash, or it was the company was called DigiCash by David Chaum, and he was a really interesting pioneer in the space of cryptography and digital cash systems. And he developed this idea of what we call blind signatures, where you allow the bank to sign messages, to sign transactions without knowing exactly what is being transferred. And this is kind of a halfway house between having a central issued money, but also allowing people to preserve privacy when they transfer it. So it's really interesting, but it never really completely overcame that barrier of, okay, you need a central issuer that's always online, checking all transactions. Again, back to that word scaled terribly. And eventually DigiCash, I think, went bust because it was trying to run this system and had kind of poor adoption. Then you also had some kind of early, and again, there's all these cryptographers, the kind of this band of brothers who were developing these systems that also inspired Satoshi Nakamoto. But there was also Wei Dai, for example. He had a protocol called B-Money, which was looking at digital signatures and how you can use them to authorize payments. And all of these different people who were thinking about various different cryptographic techniques for money, for digital money, this all inspired what we saw with Bitcoin. And Satoshi Nakamoto in his white paper released in 2008, that combined loads of these different things, right? It was heavily inspired by them. has references to things like Wade I's B money in there. But yeah, really Bitcoin is so significant because it was the first system to put all the pieces together and create a digital cash system that did not need an online central authority to validate all the transactions. It didn't have this single point of failure risk for monetary policy, like you said, we have with central banks and fiat money. And it also enables things like micropayments. So it overcomes that gold bullion fractionalization problem that we said, the divisibility. So it kind of did all these things at once. And I think that's why we're in where we are now, where digital cash, digital money is so heavily about blockchain and Web3.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned micropayments as well. Like we kind of say that digital cash should represent or replicate the properties of cash within the digital space. But we can really go one step further and actually, add new characteristics and abilities that we didn't have with cash, and we should be able to do that, right, in the digital space. Yeah. And I think when we go into a bit later, when we go into the characteristics of digital cash at a high level, we will mention some of the kind of the reasons or the abilities that digital cash should have or generally does have, and why it's so important in the digital age. So really quickly, how does digital cash relate to Web3? We kind of touched on it a little bit, Jack, but in your mind, what's the alignment there?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that it's very clear what I just said in Bitcoin being the very first really successful digital cash implementation that had all the properties that you'd want of a digital cash system. So no central point of failure, low fees to use it, used all the cryptographic techniques at its disposal, like digital signatures, for example. It really, having robust digital cash for the internet, and at the time when it came out, we'd already gone into the world of your PayPals and Visas dominating online transactions. So for me, Web3 is coming from the same place that Bitcoin was, right? And digital cash is just effectively the money we'll use in Web3, and all the principles around privacy, so maintaining user privacy, the ownership piece you meant, and how you can have digital money, digital cash act as a bearer instrument. So you can present me with a Bitcoin transaction that's signed and valid, and I can check that. And all I need to know is that signature is valid. I don't need to know who you are. I just need to get the transaction in my hands. It acts like a bearer instrument in that sense and replicates physical cash, but in a much more robust way, so that they're intrinsically linked to me.
Yeah, I like that. I like that you're kind of saying there's a principle alignment between Web3 and digital cash. It's all around kind of ownership, and with ownership comes the privacy preservation, the increased security, but there's also the underlying things around interoperability as well. And I like that these kind of maybe disparate fields in a way have so much overlap and alignment, and they're kind of maybe the success of Web3 is kind of completely dependent on the success of a digital cash engine. Like you say, so much of Web3 is based on Bitcoin, right?
Exactly. And I would also say, efficiency is key. I think when we think about Web3, it's very much how can we make processes more efficient, and how can we do things in a better way than we could do before. And when we talked earlier about physical money and even commodity-backed monies, having a digital cash system is much more efficient than having a physical cash system. You don't have the same costs associated with storage and securing physical assets. You can push things to the edges, like we talk about in data sovereignty, where people can actually self-custody their own funds if they want to. So yeah, it's highly efficient from a user perspective, which is why I think it's very much a Web3 it's a Web3 tool for me.
And I think the big one that we kind of touch on sometimes is around it's characteristics. So we're kind of maybe getting into it a bit early, but the smart contracts and the programmability, like the idea of being able to, automatically give funds based on some fulfillment of a contract. And that comes down to the efficiency stuff, right? So should we go to ChatGPT, see if we've covered everything?
Why not? Yeah, let's just round it off with ChatGPT. So you go ahead, Alec, read us out what it thinks.
So ChatGPT, I've asked it to explain digital cash for me. And a friend has said, digital cash refers to electronic representations of currency used for online transactions and other forms of digital commerce. Unlike physical currency, digital cash exists only in a digital form, making it well suited for online and electronic activities. Below are some examples that constitute digital cash. So we have electronic money or e-money, then cryptocurrencies / digital cash, and then CBDCs. So these are the 3 types. Okay, that's an interesting one. So it's given us 3 different types apparently.
Yeah, and we didn't really mention CBDCs specifically as an example of digital cash, and we kind of only hinted to it being on the horizon, but it very much is a whole new classification under this umbrella of digital cash. So yeah, I think there's a lot to cover in going through the different types of digital cash. You know, as you said, digital currency, cryptocurrencies, where there's even more different types to talk about, like stable coins, back to fiat, and they're commodity backed, algorithmic backed. There's so many different types, and now CBDCs. So I think that will be a really good topic for a second part of this episode. And I think this is a sensible place for us to kind of close off. We've covered the history, the extensive history of money and cash, and now also of digital cash. And I think this is a good place to maybe pause, and then we'll go into the details and drill down there in the next episode. So yeah, with that, we'll say thank you for listening wherever you may be, and we'll join you next time to untangle a little more of Web3.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.